Here we go. Morning, everyone. Welcome to researchED Home. Today we have Sam Twiselton with us, which is fantastic because if there is one expert in ITT, that is her. Sam is director of the Sheffield Institute of Education at Sheffield Hallam University, but she is also a policy influencer. She seemed to be in all the groups, Sam, and particularly she was chair at the of the DfE ITT framework group. So today she's going to be talking from a real position of expertise. So we'll just wait for a couple more people to join us.
Okay.
And Sam, if you want to take over and get started. Thank you.
Okay, so this is the first time I have shared my screen with lots of people. Let's hope this is going to work. Yeah, does that work? Can you see it?
That's fine.
Excellent.
If you just
get it into. Oh. It seems to take a bit longer, doesn't it, when you're doing it?
Yeah, all great.
Through the ether. Okay, so thanks for the introduction, Helene. I know people are probably still joining, so I'll try not to go too fast. I am sort of wearing two hats today, the two hats that Helene mentioned. So I suppose the main one probably is the chair of the advisory group of the ITT Core Content Framework, which was published just before the election. It's been out for a while now, due to come in next year. And I am going to be talking about that. But actually, because Helene and Matt have made these sessions now long, I got a little bit overexcited when I thought, well, actually, that doesn't take an hour to do that. And what I'd probably prefer to do, rather than launching straight into it, is to talk about these two other things, and in particular, spend some time on my research into teacher development before I then get into the detail of the framework itself. So I'm going to spend probably 20 minutes, maybe even half an hour on that, simply because I personally think it's a useful backdrop to explain why I personally, and lots of others agree with me, think that the ITT Core Content Framework, if implemented in the right way, is a really good thing, particularly when taken in conjunction with the Early Career Framework, which is designed to complement. And I will say a bit more about that in the second half of my presentation. If I can start with my research, as I say, I think it helps to sort of lead into where we are now policy-wise. So this is the research I'm going to share with you. It started with my PhD research quite a long time ago. In fact, you'll see how long a bit later on in the presentation. And it was looking at student teachers, trainee teachers, as you might call them. I tend to call them student teachers, across a range of different ITT programs. Some of them were undergraduate, some of them were postgraduate. And data was collected over a period of about 4 years. Every year there was quite a large cross-section sample of people who at the beginning, in the middle, or towards the end of their ITT experience. And the methodology was the same for all of them. It involved observing them teach a lesson in school and taking lots and lots of notes of everything they said and everything that they did during that lesson, really detailed notes. I'm sure today there'd be a more technology-enabled, whizzier way of doing it, but it was basically just scribbling lots of things down and then sitting down with them as soon as possible after the lesson and having a really detailed conversation with them that was tape recorded, mainly going through those notes on an almost sort of second by second, moment by moment basis, really trying to get them to unpick and remember what was in their head at any particular moment during that lesson. And in particular, try and get a sense of what they thought they were trying to achieve, whether they thought they'd been successful or not, in saying what they said or doing what they did at that particular time. And so lots of these interviews, all recorded, then transcribed. Then, like you do, you look at them to see what the data is telling you in terms of themes and patterns. And lots of different things came out of that data. It was a really rich set of data. But something that kind of transpired fairly early on in this analysis and then proved to be a really useful set of categories that was kind of consistent throughout the study was that you could roughly categorise, or maybe put on a sliding scale, might be a better way of thinking about it, these students into one of three categories. And I'm just going to take you through those categories now. And whether you're a trainee teacher yourself, whether you're somebody involved in ITT, or whether you're just somebody who's interested, I'm hoping that these categories might just ring a bell, either for yourself or maybe for people that you've mentored or spent time with. So the task manager category, these are really typical things of the kinds of things a task manager might say at any particular point in the interview in terms of what they were trying to do. Trying to get them to do something, trying to get something finished, getting it done. And really, if you kind of analyse the sorts of things that they said, you could summarise them according to things that are in this box here. So the overriding kind of thing that these students were trying to achieve was that they wanted children to complete their tasks, that the classrooms should be orderly, children should do what they're told, that the teacher, above all, should look like they're in control. Classrooms should look busy in an orderly way. The control behaviour really overriding kind of things that was driving the decision making of these students, and absolutely completely takes me back to my first placement, in fact to many Septembers, even when I was an experienced teacher, where unless you are sure that the children will do as you tell them and that things will get completed and that you are in control, and when you want them to line up for playtime they'll line up, and when you want them to look at you they'll look at you. These are really important things that if you haven't got those strategies in place, you can't think about anything else, because you can't really get anything else done until they are. And so very, very important to recognise that this is an important sort of phase in teachers' development, and to make sure that you're giving them the tools and the strategies that are going to help them to feel more confident and competent about this. And then hopefully you might see that they possibly might move into the next phase and see if you can see the difference between the curriculum deliverers, which is what we call this category, and being a task manager. So to be a task manager, to mainly fall in that category, you weren't really talking about learning, you were talking about tasks as something that were ends in themselves, whether it's a piece of writing, an exercise, a worksheet, a game that had to be played, whatever. It was a task that was driving the behaviour, whereas curriculum deliverers did talk about learning. So to be called a curriculum deliverer, you needed to be talking about learning outcomes. Quite often you're talking about the curriculum, you're talking about something that you knew you needed to cover. In order to be a curriculum deliverer, not the next category that I'll go on to in a minute though, it was how they were talking about learning that made them different from the next category. The questions were quite probing in this interview, and they asked them, you know, why does this curriculum matter? Why does this thing you want these children to understand or be able to do? Why does it matter beyond the fact that somebody has told you, whether it's because it's in the national curriculum, or maybe it's class teacher has given you, or subject teacher has given you this because it's in their planning, or maybe it's in a published scheme. But, you know, why does it matter? And these student teachers hadn't really thought about it in that way, and therefore weren't really able to answer those questions in any meaningful way. At this point in their thinking, they were just given something that they were delivering to these children. And that is quite enough, actually, because it's quite hard to make sure that you are covering a curriculum and that the outcomes are being achieved. And that was really enough for them to exercise their thinking. And they hadn't really got to a point where they were thinking in that sort of bigger picture way of what is the point of this and what is it leading to. And again, I think perfectly understandable. I can relate to this, not just when I was a student teacher, but when I'm maybe teaching something for the first time, or I'm trying to get my head around a new plan or a new area, I may well be thinking like a curriculum deliverer. I'm kind of ticking off the objectives, and that is probably quite enough for now. Hopefully, if I show you the final category that we call concept skill builders, you can see a bit of a difference in terms of how they were talking about their practice. You can see they are talking about learning, but they're talking about it in a less restricted way. They are much more focused on the subject they're trying to teach these children, the thing they're trying to get them to understand, and they can respond to those questions about why it matters. Now, These tended to be the most self-critical group of student teachers that they were. They were often completely beating themselves up about everything that they thought they'd got wrong in that lesson. So if you remember, the questions were, what you're trying to achieve. So they would say they're trying to achieve things like this, but quite often they felt like they'd not been successful. That's because what they were trying to achieve is so much harder than getting tasks finished, or even ticking off objectives on somebody else's curriculum. For these students, the tasks mattered only in as much as they'd been useful and successful as a vehicle for learning, likewise with the curriculum. So quite often they were, criticising the fact that they'd come up with the wrong things for the children to do, which meant that it actually wasn't really helping their understanding. Because for them, their main goal lay beyond just finishing that lesson and getting something finished at the end of it. It was, they wanted these children to understand in a way that was going to transfer to future lessons, maybe to life outside the classroom even, in a way that therefore is going to transform their understanding, has that transformative element of education. Quite a big ask, and therefore not surprising that they often felt they were unsuccessful. However, if you looked at what they were doing in their lessons, you would see quite big differences, and I will come back to that in a minute. Many years later, when the great Sutton Trust report about what makes good teaching came out, and I heard Rob Coe talking about it, there were some real resonances in this slide in particular, where Rob is talking about things that can become proxies for learning. So if we see them in a classroom, we think, oh, that looks like that's going well, but actually don't necessarily guarantee that learning is happening. So if we take the ones at the top here, they really, for me, kind of link with what task managers were saying. So if the students are busy, if work's getting done, if they're engaged, if they're interested, if everything's ordered and calm and under control, then that is success. And that is a classic task manager kind of way to think about your practice. If you look at the ones at the bottom, curriculum's being covered, some of the answers are correct, but actually if we really think about it, might they have known those answers already, or do they really understand them? Will they remember them tomorrow, next week, next month? Will they be able to apply that understanding in different contexts? You don't necessarily know from some of the kind of closed answers that you might be getting that at the time might feel like they're proxies for learning. Again, real classic curriculum delivery way of thinking about practice. I've ticked it off, I've got some evidence that the students have done it, maybe understood it, so that for me is success. Whereas compared to the concept skill builders, what you get is something quite different. And here's a little snapshot of a sort of typical concept skill builder kind of combination of things that they were doing, so the observational data and also how they were talking about it. So this isn't by any means comprehensive of everything they said. Remember, these are interviews that took over an hour, but just to give you a snapshot. So this is a question about persuasive writing and how this concept skill builder was talking about it. So they talked about things like what the children had done, and actually did talk about what they were going to go on to do next. They talked about the subject and the things that they needed to know and understand and really get about this particular thing around persuasive writing and the different aspects of persuasive writing that were considered to be important in this particular lesson. And they had some really good texts that they were able to talk about meaningfully as being good examples of that. But then they combined that knowledge of the subject with what they knew about these children. And this is where it's often hard for student teachers, because they may not know the children that well. But this concept skill builder knew them well enough to know what was going to motivate them, what was going to interest them, what might be the barriers to their learning, what might be the hooks to their learning. So that pedagogical subject knowledge, where the subject and your knowledge of the children and how to make that subject accessible and meaningful to these children comes together in this kind of talk. And there were contextual things, had it been wet playtime, what time of day it was. And then there was ability to then use the strategies and think about the subject in a way that's got this kind of broader understanding, how it's going to be applied in the next lesson, how it might be applied in other subjects, persuasive writing being a really good example for that kind of thing. And then when you actually looked at what they were doing, so if you really looked at the observational data, this is where you saw a big difference between the concept skill builders, and the kinds of things that the task managers and the curriculum deliverers were doing. So again, quite a messy slide. Don't worry if you're not getting your head around it all. But just in the space of a few minutes, you could see evidence that these student teachers were using a wide range of strategies. They're using observing really carefully to understand, to get a sense of what the children were kind of getting their head around, recognising when there was a problem, when there was a misconception, but also when there was some evidence of sort of progress, helping the children to make links between the text that they were looking at and the writing that they were going to do, and the associating of the powerful verbs from one to the other. Really sophisticated range of strategies. What the task managers and the concept skill builders tended to do was do the same thing again and again and again. So maybe repeat the instructions again and again, or keep the order, get the children busy, keep them occupied, remind them to be quiet, that kind of thing, as opposed to these much higher order skills. So we'll link all this back to the framework in a minute, but what I'm going to do before I do that is look at some of the literature that was helpful in moving my thinking forward as we were gathering this data. So when you're doing research, as well as gathering your own data, you have a look at what other people have been doing in similar sort of field to see whether it challenges your thinking or whether it moves it forward. And we looked at lots of things and they did both. But there were two studies that I think are particularly helpful, and I've shared them a lot recently, and people agree with me that they find them helpful too. So Tosh and Mumby, similar methodology to mine. They observed teachers teaching, and then they talked to them about the decisions that they'd made throughout that lesson afterwards. And they very deliberately targeted two types of teacher. So they went for people who by their peers were considered to be real expert teachers, experienced expert teachers, and then people right at the beginning of their careers who were just getting started and were novices. And they were interested to see what was the same, because they imagined there would be lots of things that would be similar, but then what really interested them was what's different, because in the difference, you're likely to find what it is that makes somebody an expert as compared to somebody who's just starting out. And the biggest thing that they found was in the way their teachers, when they really were helped to deconstruct it, and sometimes it took quite a lot of sort of probing to get there, because a lot of this has become automatic, so you really need to sort of think about it in order to realise this is what was going on. So any particular given moment during the lesson, what the expert teachers were doing in order to know the best thing to say or the best thing to do to really make this effective in terms of moving the children's learning forward, was synchronising. They were synchronising knowledge from a big range of sources. It's a bit like on that previous slide, where things like what they know about the subject, but much more important, well, not more importantly, but equally importantly, how to make this subject accessible and meaningful for these children at the stage of development they're at. Also, what's going to motivate them, what's going to interest them, what might be making them anxious, what misconceptions they might have, things like the time of day and whether it's been a wet playtime, whether somebody's hamster's died, all of those things, many of which were automatic. It took some probing for them to realise that that was on their mind at that point, and that's why they said what they said and the way they said it. Was synchronised into making them best decision about what to say and what to do. And those of you who have ever felt like you're kind of getting to grips with teaching and they've had a good lesson, if you think back on it, you probably were doing that. You were synchronising lots of different kinds of knowledge in order to make the best decisions. You may not have been aware you were doing it at the time, but if you think about it now, that's what was happening. Whereas novice teachers, they talked about this much more linear way of using time and knowledge. So actually it was mostly planned out in advance. And again, we put a lot of emphasis on planning at the beginning of somebody's career. It is important that you've anticipated as much as you can beforehand. Nothing wrong with that. But it meant that they were not able to draw on all the other knowledge in the flexible, responsive way that the expert teachers had. So they tended to have a plan which would say, I'm going to do A, then B, then C, then D, and that's what they did. And that was much less effective. It created a much narrower range of strategies, just as happened with my data, in terms of their ability to really help the children kind of get going with their understanding and get underneath the skin of the subject. Second study I want to just briefly mention, which I think is also very useful, is Sternberg and Horvath. They were also interested in trying to work out what makes somebody an expert. They didn't just look at teaching though, they actually looked at a range of different professions that they knew in some ways would look very different, but they were also interested to see, is there anything that all these experts have in common? So we can begin to sort of crystallise what we think you really need, regardless of what the profession is, if you're going to be expert at it. And they boiled it down to these three things and see again if it has any resonance for you. So what they found was you do need to know things. If you're a teacher, you need to know quite a lot about what it is that you're teaching these children. So you have to have that subject knowledge. But the bit that really interested me about this wasn't just that you need to know stuff, it's how you know it that was more important. This really links back to the conversation I was having with Matt Hood last week, if any of you have watched that, where he was talking about mental models. So it's how you know the thing that you're trying to do in relation to the situation that's before you, so that you are accessing the most relevant knowledge in a form that is going to be most applicable to this situation. So that takes us into insight. So your ability to analyse situation in front of you and know, in the case of teachers, that for these learners on this day, in this context, so all of that other stuff that Tosh and Mumby found coming in there, this is how I make this knowledge accessible. So that ability to analyse and know immediately from that analysis what you need to focus on to make it effective. And with that comes a need to be really efficient, because actually, if you think about it, in a class of 30 odd children, and you're trying to teach them something new, or you're trying to consolidate something that you've already started, there are so many different things that you could potentially think about. It's no wonder it's easy to get paralysed by that. And it's certainly no wonder you're absolutely exhausted quite often at the end of that process. What the experts had done, though, is they'd made a lot of those things become automatic to the point where they were barely having to think about them. They were just doing them, allowing them to then focus their attention on the things that were the higher order things, which was just how do I explain this in the way that's really going to mean something? And a good analogy here is if you think about learning to drive. I can really remember the first time I sat in the driver's seat with my dad in the passenger seat, explaining about bite points and clutches and accelerators and gears and handbrakes. And oh my God, the information overload was petrifying. And that ability to be able to find a bite point and move the car forward it felt like a huge mountain at the time. And yet only a few months later, you're changing gears without even realising it, because most of that has become automatic. And that's what you need for good teachers. That's what a lot of the core content framework and the early career framework is trying to do. It's trying to get you to a point where the things that can be huge barriers, the task managers and the curriculum deliverer kind of worries, have become so much more automatic that you're not having to think about them anymore, which means that you can devote your time to really thinking about the learning and how to make it accessible to these learners. So again, linking back to what we were talking about with Matt last week, it's about the mental model that you have and the things that are automatic and the things that you're therefore able to focus on. This schema is a term that I think is really useful, that help you to select the most relevant information and know how to act on it. So schema serve as a guide to action, same thing really as the mental model. So what all of these different ways of trying to explain good teaching do, I think, one way or another, are show that a really effective teacher iterates, whether consciously or unconsciously, and usually it's a bit of both, between a big picture understanding of what it is that you're trying to achieve. And it's so important that at regular intervals you do remind yourself about that, because it's very easy to get bogged down in things that aren't big picture. But then how does that translate into practice in the micro moment of this decision I've got to make, you know, at this point in the lesson? So it's that iteration between big picture and detail that kind of stands out as a feature of expertise. Going back to my data then, just keeping an eye on the time, there is a sense in which the categories I described earlier are sort of a developmental continuum. So you're quite likely to go through these different phases as you move through your course. Having said that, there are lots of things that make you revert. So you go back to being a task manager, even though you might have been a curriculum deliverer or a concept skill builder. Typically, if you start a new school, new class, new subject, quite often it's just something basic like somebody walking through the door with a clipboard that you know that you're going to observe you. Suddenly that makes you really focus on the more superficial things about order and management and so on, and that happens to all of us, not just to student teachers. So it's quite possible to revert. It's not sort of smooth linear thing. It is also possible to get trapped, particularly in the curriculum deliverer category. So you could be teaching for quite a long time and still being mainly a curriculum deliverer in how you think about your practice. Of course, it's actually a lot messier than any of these things. You can't ever capture something as complex as teaching and how you develop expertise on a diagram like this, but it's still a useful sort of heuristic, a useful model for thinking about phases of development. So there was a sense in which, depending on how far they were through their course, these students were more likely to be in one or more of these categories. However, I'm coming back to this slide now because one of the things that should prove to be much more important to their progression through those categories than I had realised at the start was the importance of context and culture, and to some extent curriculum. And the curriculum example springs to mind, and this is the bit that dates the study, in that the data was collected during a period where the national strategies, literacy and numeracy strategies, were being implemented. And so there was data that was collected just before, some during the initial implementation and some a bit later. And during that initial implementation year, a really interesting thing that happened was that all the teachers we talked to, regardless of how far through their course they were, talked like curriculum deliverers. And this is a really typical quote. It was a very, very prescribed, it's actually great, I'm not knocking it, but getting your head around it initially was just like this for everybody. So I can vividly remember this interview with this fourth year specialist who should have been a concept skill builder. She'd been on the course for 4 years, right at the end of her placement, and I was surprised that the answers that she was giving me were all about sort of ticking boxes. Is it text level? Is it word level? Is it sentence level? That kind of thing. And when I asked, so what's the point of all that? She said, you're asking me these questions, Sam, and I haven't got time to think like that. This thing is like a steamroller. If I don't just keep running, it'll flatten me. And that's how a big prescribed curriculum can feel if you haven't got your head around it. It made me think about the work of a guy called Michael Arrow, who talked about a very strong tendency that can happen in schools, where in order to sort of navigate your way through the complexity of what has to happen in school, you've developed routines, but the routines, if you're not careful, become an end in themselves. You can't see beyond the routine. You forget why it was set up in the first place. And this is why I've published a set of papers at the time called Seeing the Wood for the Trees. Too much stuff crowds out your ability to see the woods for the trees. And that's what was happening in the early days of literacy strategy. However, the context that the students were in still was more important than something external like the strategy. If they were in schools where people were talking about their practice and talking about how to implement something like this, and they were reflecting on it and they were analysing it, and in an ideal world, looking at evidence bases and so on, that really helped the students to progress into concept skill building ways of thinking about practice. The culture of the school, and whether it was routine, whether it's kind of informally through what happens in the staff room, or more formally through regular getting together to talk in learning sets and so on, it made a huge difference if they were in those kind of schools. The other thing that really made a difference was if they were put in contexts where they were sort of forced to contrast different approaches. So things like just hopping over the border into Scotland, into a Scottish school, spending some time in there, even better if it's a completely different country, or just a school that's got a very different approach to behaviour or to the curriculum, made a big difference. Just helped them think bigger picture and think differently about their practice. And you'll see in the core content framework there's quite a lot about comparing and contrasting and critiquing. Really important that trainee student teachers do that, because it really helps them think about that bigger picture, and that then has that really helpful impact on their practice. So now I am getting to the ITT core content framework, and luckily I've got half an hour to go, a bit less than that. So that's good. So that's what I'm going to talk about now, but again, I'm going back a little bit before I get into the detail of the framework itself. I could have gone further back than I am doing, but I'm going to go back to the Carter Review, which is another group that I sat on a few years ago now, which I think provides good context for why we need the core content framework. So this is the review. I'm not going to say too much about it, but you can see it took place over sort of six to 9 months. My university released me full-time to accompany Andrew Carter on this review, so I was working on it quite intensively, and you can see, if you look at what was involved, a lot of different things. We talked to lots of people, we visited lots of providers. When we visited the providers, we talked to trainees, we talked to NQTs, we talked to the people who'd employed them, we talked to people who were delivering the training, we talked to mentors and so on. So we talked to lots of people. We also talked to lots of experts, and here's an example from one of those expert discussions. So we know that it's important that in their initial teacher training, student teachers get to know things about SEND. Of course, it goes without saying that's really important. This is the set of notes from the expert group who are saying what they thought somebody needed to have covered in their ITT year in order to be confident and competent as a newly qualified teacher in relation to SEND. Now, you can't read it, that doesn't matter. You can see it well enough, hopefully, to see it's basically a list, so it's a bit of an expanded list that runs to 15 pages of things that you need to know in order to feel confident and confident in SEND. And this is just one expert discussion. We had 11 in total, and each yielded a similar set of notes. And then again, every time we visited a provider, we had a similar set of notes. It's a lot of stuff, isn't it? If you could read it, you probably wouldn't disagree with very much of it, because you do need to know that stuff. But just think about it for a minute. If you're on a PGCE or any form of postgraduate ITT, you've basically got 9 months when you take out the holidays, 2/3 of which is spent in school. Rightly, that's a very powerful place where learning happens, but it severely limits the time that's left to cover this kind of stuff. So two implications from that. One is it has to happen in school, and that's really important. But the other is it's just not realistic to really meaningfully have grasped all this in a way that you can apply it to practice in the space of 9 months. That's probably the biggest finding from the review. The review itself, we actually saw that people had really made a good fist of trying to cram a lot of stuff in a meaningful way as possible into that short space of time. But inevitably, it was inconsistent because you got to make choices. You can't do everything really well in 9 months. So you maybe give more attention to behaviour, and that gives you less time on subject knowledge, or vice versa. And the NQTs, often an awful lot of it, when we spoke to them about what they'd learnt in the prior year, it just washed over to the point where some of them didn't even remember having it at all. What then intrigued me more, really, as a result of this experience, is it isn't so much how much stuff you cover, it's how you do it. It's back to the mental models in a way. The best providers had thought so carefully about what kind of knowledge you need and when. That way it does come back to my idea of development continuum. Really important that you get some basic behaviour and classroom organisation skills under your belt early on, because you can't think beyond it until you've got it. Then you need to come back at it at a higher level, more sophisticatedly, when you've got more experience. So how you do that, and who does it, and how often, and where and when, and how you make the most of the school-based experience, because that's where the most powerful learning tends to happen, although you do need the time and space, as they're going to say, to think about it as well. That's what makes the difference. But regardless of how well you've done all that, ITE, if it's a 9 months course, is not long enough and not sufficiently joined up to early career support, or it wasn't at the time. What we found at the time, this was back in 2014, school-based teacher training was really taking off, and the more traditional forms of teacher training were also really embracing partnership working. And where you had schools that were involved in the initial teacher training with a view that they were then going to employ those people that they'd trained initially as NQTs, they had actually started to address that problem of it not being long enough by carrying on into our NQT and RQT and off and beyond. But the fact that they'd done that and it was so effective, and the NQTs we talked to were so complimentary about it, shone a light on the fact that as a system, that wasn't in place for everybody. The system was fractured, even though there might be sort of local examples of it being addressed. It wasn't there as a guarantee, and coordination was lacking. And we did say this in the report, but probably didn't say it loud enough, and it took a while really to fast forward to this situation, where you probably don't need me to tell you, but in recent years we've had an ongoing and getting worse problem with teacher recruitment and teacher retention. And we need more teachers every year, partly because more and more teachers are leaving, and they're leaving earlier and earlier every year. And that's a problem everywhere, but it's an even worse problem in the areas of the country that have the biggest need for the best teachers, because they've got the most deprived children. But actually, if you look at the data, this is South Yorkshire, but it will be the same for everywhere. The more affluent the school, the more qualified and the more stable the workforce. So you're much more likely in the more deprived schools with the really deprived catchment areas to have the biggest problems in terms of recruiting and retaining teachers. So you've got lots of unqualified teachers, you've got lots of supply teachers, you've got lots of people on a fixed term contract. In secondary, you tend to have more than half the teachers, at least in the shorter subjects, teaching something they haven't got a degree in. And this is getting worse every year. And I suspect it might get even worse as a result of the situation that we're in now. So at last, a couple of years ago, the DfE really woke up to this and took it seriously and published a strategy last year, the teacher recruitment and retention strategy. It's got lots of good things in. I'm not going to go through them all. But a major focus of it, sorry, I had a slide about this. Yes, it's there, sorry. Is the transforming the support for early career teachers. What they recognised was the outcome of what I said earlier from the Carter Review, and it being too short in initial teacher training, is that the expectations on NQTs could be such they're expected to hit the ground running and be this expert teacher when all they've had is 9 months, and that creates a really stressful, high workload, high anxiety situation. It's not like that for everybody, but it's like that for enough that more and more of them were leaving earlier and earlier, which is bad for the profession. It's wasteful of resources. It also means that children are never getting more experienced teachers in front of them because they're just constantly being replaced by more inexperienced teachers. So the early career framework was published at the same time as the teacher recruitment and retention strategy. And then a few months later, they decided to do the ITT core content framework. So just to briefly say about the early career framework, that is 2 years of guaranteed high quality ongoing support and development for NQTs and for RQTs. So it's effectively extending that training period. So even if you just had a 9-month PGCE, you've got another 2 years after that. So that adds up to around 3 years of high quality support and development for everybody in the system, which is a massive step forward. In order to get the most out of that though, it's really important that the ITT bit joins up to it as seamlessly as possible, just like those providers that I talked about earlier had managed to do with their own programs. So in about this time last year, this group was set up that I was asked to chair. It had a range of different people, including school-based, university-based people, and people who'd been involved in the development of the early career framework. Great group to work with. So the aim is, I've got a picture of Velcro here, the aim is to Velcro what happens in initial teacher training, regardless of where you do it, as long as it's somewhere in England, into what you then get as an early career teacher through the early career framework. It's the Velcroing of those two things together to make a kind of coherent minimum 3-year entitlement. That is what the core content framework is there to do. The framework itself, hopefully you may have had a look at it. If you haven't, have a look at it after this. It has an introduction, quite a long introduction, that we didn't really want to call an introduction, but we couldn't find a better title, so that's what it ended up being called. And the reason why we didn't want to call it introduction is, if you're anything like me, you probably don't read introductions very carefully, if at all. And you jump straight to what feels like the meat of the document, which is the framework itself. Please do read it, particularly if you're a provider of ITT, or if you're somebody who's involved as a mentor or in some kind of in-school role, because there's some important things are said there. And that includes what the framework isn't. It's not a fully blown curriculum. it's a framework that picks up some of those elements that I talked about when I was talking about my research that are needed if you're going to progress your expertise in training. But it doesn't tell you the sequence that you have to do them. It doesn't tell you everything that you need to do. There are lots of things beyond what's in that framework that you need to do. The point of the framework is to join up to the early career framework. That's that Velcroing thing. So there's still a job of work for providers to do, to look at the curricula that they've got already. And for most people, it's just going to be a question of tweaking it, maybe changing a little bit of the terminology to adapt it and making sure that the framework is covered. But there'll still be lots of things in your curriculum that aren't in the framework that need to stay there. It's not an assessment framework. You still need to use the standards to assess. So it shouldn't be a case, if you're a trainee, that you're expected to accumulate evidence to show that you've met the ITT framework. That's not what it's there for. It's there as an entitlement, not as something that you've got to demonstrate. And it's organised like this, which is the same format as the early career framework. So you've got these two columns, a learn that column and a learn how to column. The learn how to column is the bit that's really different. The learn that is actually identical to the early career framework, because the knowledge that you need to develop is pretty much the same, whether you're a trainee or whether you're a new teacher. How you develop it and the kind of support that you need to develop is the bit that's different. So in the right-hand column, that's where you'll see the differences. And what we try to do is be a bit more specific than previously in pinning down the kinds of experiences that you should have, the kinds of skills that you need to practice, the kinds of videos or observations that you need to be analysing, the kinds of conversations you need to be having when you're in school, in order to really develop that knowledge in a way that gets you to that concept skill building way of thinking about your practice. It's organised into these different areas, because those are the areas of the early career framework, which are then cross-reference the standards, because obviously you do need to demonstrate you've met the standards. It's the standards that are the assessment thing, not the framework itself. The learn that, as I've said, is deliberately identical to the early career framework. That was quite a big conversation, because we could have added more stuff in there. There were things I'd like to have seen in there about child development, for example, a bit more about subject knowledge and pedagogical subject knowledge, all that stuff I was talking about earlier. But because we wanted that Velcroing with the early career framework, we haven't put it in. That doesn't mean you can't put it in as a provider. It's really important that what's in there has been underpinned by evidence. The EEF have been heavily involved in that, but it's not a definitive body of all knowledge that's needed in ITE, as I've said already. And that knowledge keeps changing and being added to as more research is published, and over time, both frameworks will also get changed and added to. The learn how to column, as I've said already, is about the key skills that you need to be practicing, whether it's practicing in school or practicing by looking at videos or practicing on your own with some of these things you could be doing now if you're a trainee. Really importantly, we've put a big emphasis on the importance of working with and learning from expert colleagues, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. In fact, I'll say it now. Expert colleagues are a range of people, and as going back to what I found on the Carter Review, the best providers had really thought hard about the expertise that's available to them. So that might include people who work in university, it might include a whole range of people who work in school, not just the mentor. The mentor's role might sometimes just be the broker to these other people. And so here's not a definitive comprehensive list, but just an example really of all the different people with whom those conversations are going to be important. Now, obviously your ITE tutor is an important part of that, and a lot of the conversations that you have with your ITE tutor will be, extremely important to your development, particularly that ability to stand back and think about the bigger picture I was talking about earlier. But that might be, if you're particularly thinking about behaviour and maybe a particular child's behaviour or a particular routine, a particular way of working, then actually the best person for you to speak to in that placement isn't even a teacher. It might be somebody who's a pastoral lead and isn't a teacher. So part of the mentor's role is to just work out who is the best person for you to speak to and make sure that you have access to that person for a conversation. Another example would be in the section on curriculum, it suggested that you need to talk to your school placement, ideally both of them, or more if you have more, about their approach to the curriculum, why they've got the curriculum that they've got, and the thought processes that went into constructing it or buying it, or however it is that they've got that curriculum, because that gets you away out of that curriculum deliverer mode into thinking more conceptually, but also gives you hopefully the opportunity to compare and contrast, because you'll get a different answer in different schools as to the choices that they've made, and that's really interesting and really helps you move your thinking on as to the extent to which the evidence base that you've looked at kind of confirms or not the responses that they're giving you. It might be simply that in the very different contexts of different schools or different catchment areas, they're equally valid but still very different. But that thought process and that looking at the evidence base and that critiquing it and being critically reflective about it is really important. But you have to have the conversation in the first place in order to have those thought processes. So that is me. I think at one point I was going to take you through all the different sections of the framework, but I don't think there's any need for me to do that. I think now you've seen the sort of the guided principles of how we've kind of arrived at what we've got in that framework and how it's organised. You've probably got enough to go and have a read it yourself and get your head around it. So there is a little bit of time, Helene, not much, but a little bit of time. If there are some questions that people have been asking every now and then, I've seen them flash up.
Yeah, there's quite a few questions in fact.
Right. So should I
firstly, lots of people have been asking if the slides will be available.
Oh, they certainly can be. Should I just send them to you, Elaine, and is that the best way to do it?
Yes, thank you. No, some really, really interesting questions, ranging from the actual content to the questions around training mentors and the support available, you know, obviously before we all start. Would you say it is important to discuss this development process that you were talking about at the beginning with the 3 stages? Do you think it's important to discuss this with the student teachers to allow them to understand that it's normal to go through all the stages?
Absolutely. I think probably maybe not right at the beginning, where it wouldn't make that much sense. If you're still kind of very much in the early days of task management, the curriculum delivery and concept skill builder bit won't mean as much to you. My experience is if you share this with people sort of in the second half of their training, it actually usually resonates very strongly. And as you say, as the questioner says, for them to understand it's normal. So you might feel right at this point, and certainly as somebody who was a primary school teacher, I never got beyond curriculum deliverer on some aspects of my practice. If you asked about teaching music, where I have very little subject knowledge, I'm never going to get beyond curriculum deliverer. So to sort of know that it's normal and not to beat yourself up if you feel like you're in a particular category, but to have the meta understanding that actually to shift yourself along further, that thinking about the bigger picture, and then that talking to more experienced experts about how they kind of achieve progression against that bigger picture is really helpful. But I think you've got to have a certain amount of experience under your belt before any of it really makes sense. So I wouldn't be doing it too early. My experience, it's sort of second half towards the end, it becomes a useful tool.
This makes sense. Someone is commenting on something quite similar, saying that perhaps each stage sort of is necessary to the next.
I think it probably is. Don't want to get sort of too sort of Piaget, and if you remember, you may not, but Piaget was his work was criticised because it made it sound like you have to go through these stages of development. There's nothing that teachers can do. The children just have to keep kind of growing older, and that's what will make them understand things differently. And actually, through these, as I've tried to make clear, you can accelerate progress through the stages, but you also can go backwards. And I think there are some examples that we saw in the data where, and it usually, if you really unpicked it, it was usually people who'd got experience under their belt prior to starting. They kind of skip the task management bit. You know, they'd got all that under the belt. So maybe if you've been a teaching assistant, or maybe you've worked with children in other contexts, or maybe you've just got the ability to command behaviour, you know, because of other experiences that you've had, you can move more quickly into curriculum delivery and then concept skill builder. But yeah, there is definitely there isn't a sort of sense of stages that most people do go through, and being aware of that.
Thank you. Someone's asking about your thoughts on the consistency and parity of teacher training courses. So I don't know if you want to say too much about that.
Well, obviously, you know, with the Carter Review, to be honest, when that was called, it was Michael Gove who called it in the dying days of being Secretary of State. He wasn't Secretary of State, actually, by the time we got into schools, but it was his idea to call it. And I think at that point it was expected. He called it thinking, well, there's a huge problem with consistency and quality of teacher training, because probably lots of people had told him that there were, and they still will. Isn't necessarily what we found, though. We went to 31 different providers, and there wasn't a single one where we didn't see lots of really good things. As I we saw inconsistency, and I think that's partly because of trying to squeeze so much into such a short time. But the other big place where I know you get the inconsistency, and if you look at Ofsted reports on ITT, it's in what happens in school, and it's whether the schools are able to devote enough time and expertise to the mentoring function, whether it's the mentor themselves or whether it's the mentor as the person who gives the trainee access to all those other people I mentioned. If really good schools take that seriously and get good people, you know, who are well experienced doing the job, and that makes all the difference. It is the make or break. Most of the NQTs that we talked to said that was the most important thing in their training, was the quality of their mentor. And that is where I think you do get a lack of consistency. And it's hard for providers to really control that, because it is out of their control. As a profession, this is why I think the frameworks are good, because it's, as a profession, we're trying to grip this jointly, not just the providers but the schools as well. And I hope the framework will help, because as I say, we try to spell out a bit more specifically than previously some of the things that good mentors or good other people in school who are support trainees can do. It shouldn't be more work, it's just more defined as to how you do the work, and I hope that will help.
So perhaps two things on that. I think the previous question came from someone who's been a mentor,
right,
and has had very varied experiences, if you like, according to where the students were coming from or their route, if you like.
Yeah.
But also from, you know, personal knowledge, and also you know, the experience of colleagues. It's quite difficult actually to carve out time, or to be granted time in schools to do this properly. So someone on this topic says, how would you recommend training mentors to understand the IT framework? Quite a good question.
Yeah, it is a good question, and you know, some of it is doing the kind of thing that I've just done, sort of explaining the rationale and the background and some of the context. But I've been doing quite a lot of that out and about until lockdown came. I've been out and about around the country talking to lots of people involved in ITT, but also equal, if not more, senior leaders in schools, and just helping them to get their head around it in that sense is a good start, I think. I don't think it's until you've lived and breathed it, though, that you'll really kind of understand what's involved. So I think certainly at Sheffield Hallam, with our partners, we are thinking hard about the ongoing support and development our mentors are going to need. We've got what we call a SHOOK, Sheffield Hallam Open Access website that has a lot of resources and videos and things like that on it that we'll be adding to. We're also involved in piloting the early career framework, and because there's such a lot of common ground, like I said, that left-hand column is identical in terms of the kind of knowledge that you're trying to develop. We can use similar or even the same resources, but used in slightly different ways to help people. So, because I think a lot of that will be, once you get into grips with it and getting your head around it, particularly because it's going to be different in the light of COVID, people are going to be going back into schools in different ways to how it was originally anticipated. So I think we've got to be flexible in terms of helping people to implement it and get their heads around it over quite a period of time, I think.
Yes, and personally, I've been kind of looking forward to having resources shared. And someone has asked just that. It's my understanding that resources are being created to support ITF. Is this the case? Core content framework? You're saying yes.
Well, the resources that I was just talking about now, specifically, we've been commissioned in our partnership with Education Development Trust and Teach First and Ambition, and UCL have also separately been commissioned to provide resources for the early career framework. So right now we've got people busily writing those materials. We've got a bit of a problem because a lot of it will be video, and obviously we can't get into schools to do those videos right now, but we will be doing that. Some of that will definitely be completely applicable to ITT. But beyond that, there will be some things that need to be ITT specific. At Sheffield Hallam, we're going to be working in partnership with the Chartered College of Teaching. They have some resources that they can used for this purpose, but they're also going to be developing more, and it's going to be a call for providers actually, because I think most providers will be doing this work to kind of pool what they're developing, or maybe what they've already got, and also what they're going to develop, so it becomes something that's accessible for everybody. So, Chartered College, certainly they're going to be launching an early career teacher hub, which is going to be for ITT and for early career teachers and their mentors. And I think you said, and those are the university and school-based national bodies are going to be involved in that as well. So hopefully there will be quite a lot available. Eventually, obviously, COVID slightly put a bit of a barrier up to some of it, but still lots of work going on.
That would certainly be very welcome, even a bank of resources, videos, things like that. Someone's asking here, to your knowledge, how are the various IT institutions embracing the ITT core content framework? I think, in other words, has there been any pushback?
There has been some pushback. I would say it's from a relatively small but quite loud, certainly my experience, probably count on one hand the voices that keep popping up, and some of those I think have calmed down and some haven't. My experience when I'm out and about has been, I would say, 99% really positive. Certainly school leaders have really embraced it. I've had very little kickback at all from school leaders, apart from the worry about the time, the mentoring, as you said. But in terms of what we're trying to achieve through the framework, everybody agrees it's a good thing. Where the kickback has come, and one of the reasons why I've been keen to get the word out and why I made a big point about what it is and what it isn't, I think it's based on some misunderstandings. So the kickback has come in two main forms. One is it's the bar is too low. So in other words, there's lots of things that you need in ITT that aren't in the framework. I sort of agree. Don't think it's too low. I wouldn't talk about high and low. But as I said, it's a framework, it's not a curriculum. And ITT providers, and we saw this in spades on the Carter Review, need to reflect their context, need to reflect the schools that they're working with, and need to reflect the trainees they're working with. They need to think about the expertise that's available to them. And so their job is to create the curriculum, and that will include quite a lot of things I mentioned, but they'll have their own version of that for their context, beyond what's in the framework. It's a minimum framework. And the point is to Velcro into the early career framework. That's what it's there for. It's not a curriculum. It doesn't give you a sense of sequence. It just tells you some of the basic things that need to be covered, and in the way that they should be covered, so that they link up in a way that's recognisable to NQTs. They can make that link. They can see the same terminology being used, etc. And so they're coming back to it at a higher level, where it probably makes more sense because they've got their own children and their own leadership team that they're accountable to and their own set of parents that they're thinking about, and so on.
This would be quite beneficial, I think, in terms of knowing that it's a common framework both for the school-based experiences and staff and the universities.
Yeah, to be honest, that was a bit I was most focused on, because from the Carter Review we knew that link up between school-based and training centre, whether it's university or skip-based, was so important, and the bit that quite often providers feel they can't control, they can control better, I think, with this framework, because they give them this more specific guidance.
Thank you. With a 2-year induction for NQTs, do you think this will have an impact on the availability of mentors for ITT?
That is something that has come up quite often as a worry, particularly when I'm talking to ITT providers. Me being the eternal optimist, but I do mean this, I'm not just putting a spin on it, I hope it'll be the opposite. Because the two frameworks are so closely aligned, and because at the same time things like the specialist NPQ for teacher developer is coming on board, what I think is happening in the system is, rightly at last, we're getting a focus on the importance of mentoring, actually not just for early career but for every level, but obviously for the case of this, for early career. And so often you find it's the same person in a school who supports trainees and supports the NQTs and RQTs. They're not having to get their head around two sets of things, having to get around one coherent sort of minimum 3-year entitlement. I think and it's going to work really well in groups of schools, teaching school alliances and MATs. It means that you can have some people who have more devoted time to a bigger group of teachers, whether it's a combination of trainees, NQTs and RQTs, so that they can do the job well and properly, in a way that's going to really support those teachers, but it's actually going to really support the mentors as well, because they can feel like they're doing the job properly. We know it helps you develop your own practice, because you're having to deconstruct your practice to make it accessible to trainees. That helps you improve it. So it will be a mechanism for school improvement as well. I know that's me being naive and optimistic in some ways, because I do recognise it's still a headache for school leaders in terms of timetabling, time release and so on. But surely the prize is worth it if at the end of all of this, it means that we're holding on to our teachers and they're getting better and better, rather than this sort of sausage factory that Becky Allen has talked about, where NQTs come and go and come and go and come and go. You're not only having, therefore, a kind of a whole load of inexperienced teachers constantly put in front of children, you're also spending an awful lot of money on recruiting new teachers every year, you know. So if you see it that way, that bigger picture way, hopefully that allays some of those concerns a little bit.
I wish I shared your optimism.
I know we've had these conversations before, haven't we?
And the follow-up question, we're going to need to wrap up very, very soon, because it's noon already. But is there going to be government funding for year 2 of the framework to give staff entitlement mentor meeting time?
There's certainly money secured for the release time for the RQTs in year 2. I'm less sure. The last time I asked, there was an ongoing conversation about what additional money for mentors. I'm not sure about that. I don't know if that's been secured or not. I have to ask the DfE.
Okay. We're going to have to wrap up. There's lots of other questions. There's some of them online, we'll see, but obviously there is so much to say. So much to say. Right, so thank you very much, Sam, for giving your time this morning and your expertise. It was enlightening. I've made loads of notes. And everyone, we need to wrap up. So have a lovely day and join us again tomorrow.
Yeah, just a final thing. If the slides are available, they do have my email address on. So if people have got questions that they really want to get into more detail, well, they can just send me an email once I put that.
That's very generous. Okay. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.